Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be looking at anti-bribery and corruption training, specifically 5 fresh ideas that we have at Interactive Services for lifting your anti-bribery and corruption training. My name is Matt Plass, I'm the Chief Learning Officer with Interactive Services, and I'm joined today by Mark DeRoche, who's our VP of Compliance Learning. We estimate the session will... Hi Mark, we estimate the session will be between 40 and 45 minutes long, and we hope you'll be able to stay with us for the journey. Okay, so we're going to look at 5 things today. We're going to look at the fact that we're all in it together, the tone coming from the top, how to write effective scenarios, how to manage the difference between global and local content, and a few suggestions around how we can get creative in these areas. At Interactive Services, we've been producing compliance training for over 20 years, so we have extensive experience in this area, and we're very happy to be able to share some of the successes that we've had with clients, with everyone who's on the call today. So in case anyone was in any doubt around the impact of an effective ethics and compliance training program on the business, we're going to spend a moment just looking at some statistics that have come out of a recent research activity around the impact of an effective ethics and compliance program. So there's a couple of statistics on the screen now which I think are interesting. On the left, we're going to be seeing what happens when you don't have an effective program, and the column on the right is what happens when you do. So this is large companies with an effective program. You'll see that the pressure to compromise standards, so the pressure from the business, possibly from your manager, your self-imposed pressure to compromise your compliance standards is much higher. It's at 23% when you don't have an effective program, and at 3% when you do. This was an anonymous survey to gather the data for the report. And interestingly, when people were asked how many of you have observed misconduct in the last 12 months, in the companies that don't have an effective program, the answer was 62% of people have seen something wrong, or that they perceive to be wrong, whereas in the companies with an effective program, that number is reduced to 33%. And now this is where the numbers start to get very interesting. If we look at the next set, we're going to ask the question, of everyone who observed the misconduct, how many do you think reported it in each instance? Now, unfortunately, this is a broadcast, not a conversation. I'd love to get your take on where you think these numbers go next. But if we have a look at the next slide now, we see that in the companies that don't have an effective program, while 62% of people saw something that was wrong, only 32% of them reported it. On the other side, where there is an effective program, only 33% of people observe misconduct, which suggests that there's less misconduct to be observed. And of those 33%, almost 90% of people reported the misconduct that they saw, which obviously is where, as a company who would like to have a culture of compliance, that's where you want to be. Interestingly, if we ask the question, why do you think so many people did not report in the companies without an effective program? I'm sure you'll be ahead of me when we reveal the answer, which is on the next slide, which is it's about retaliation. So of the 32% of people who did report misconduct within the companies without an effective program, 59% cited retaliation as the reason why they refused to report. Whereas in the companies with an effective program, that number is reduced to 4%. So immediately we see that this is really beyond training on the facts around compliance. This is around the culture. This is around how comfortable people feel speaking up when they see something wrong. Not only their ability to recognize when something's wrong, but their comfort levels in raising a hand and without fear of retaliation. So if we move on, I think we're going to, I think we've made the case that effective programs make a difference. We're going to focus the rest of this webinar on how we create effective anti-bribery and corruption training. And as we talk about each individual case, case in point, we're going to perhaps pull out a couple of examples from our experience of pulling together compliance training into what we're calling the Compliance Learning Center, which is a suite of compliance products. The first concept we want to look at is the idea that we're all in it together. What does this mean? Well, I think we have to accept that everyone in our company, we should assume that everyone in our company wants to do the right thing, that we care about the community and we're not criminals. This is very important. We see a lot of compliance training that focuses on high-level misdoings and misdeeds. It could be money laundering, it might be insider trading, but often the scenarios we see in the training courses assume a deliberation on the part of the participants, which really we know is not there in 99.9% of our employees. Our employees want to do the right thing. They do care about the community. They're not criminals, and yet we are showing them scenarios that assumes that we're trying to speak to criminals and ask them to give up their criminality. It takes more than an e-learning course to turn a criminal into a non-criminal. What we're talking about, what we should be talking about, are the risks that we all face every day, the lines that we walk every day, the small actions we can take to remain compliant, the things we need to be aware of, the risks that we need to be able to spot and move away from, and again, that comfort level about speaking up. People want to do the right thing, but when they observe wrongdoing, they don't always do the right thing. They don't always speak up. They don't always feel safe, and they don't want to look foolish. And in fact, although we cited retaliation as a core reason why people don't speak up, I think number 5 here is equally important. People don't want to look dumb. They don't want to put their hand up and find that the thing they thought was a problem, actually, it's not a problem, and hey, you've wasted my time, and hey, we've lost that deal, and now you've made us look stupid, and it's all your fault. So when we talk about creating compliance training, our scenarios really should focus around people who want to do the right thing, and we're guiding them through making fantastic decisions that keep themselves and their organization safe and preserve the reputation of the industry. But we should also be very clear that putting your hand up and saying that you might have seen a problem is not going to bring down a deluge of retribution, or are you going to be held up as someone who's taken a foolish action. We want to engender a culture in which you raise your hand, it gets looked into, hopefully it's not a problem. If it is, it will get dealt with. If it's not, well, thank you for raising your hand, because it's by raising your hand that we avert the big disasters. We don't want to read about this on the headline of the Times. We want to hear about this before it happens.
I'll just jump in there. Sammy, what we've got there is some great principles on the screen. We created our own best practice anti-bribery training this year in 2015 that is based around those principles that Matt's discussed there, and you'll see a series of screen grabs throughout. That's available for you to take a look at the end of this presentation. The one thing I would say is when we went about creating this piece of training, a lot of compliance training historically has started with the legal team being the lead-in for creating the training. We sat down with a consortium of learning professionals who head up compliance training at a series of Global 100 firms, and I think that really allowed us to focus on the audience that we're teaching, which is adult professionals who want to do the right thing and be empowered. And we've really moved away from this idea of compliance training almost treating our employees as criminals, and instead focusing on teaching adults who can contribute to the business. And you'll see that flow throughout the training that we created in this area.
Thanks, Mark. So if we move on to the second concept, which is the tone at the top. For anyone who follows FIFA and the international soccer, they'll know that the tone you set at the top is extremely important. The way senior leaders behave, the messages that they give to the organization, have a huge impact on the way people behave. If you get the tone at the top right, you are already halfway towards having your culture of compliance. If you get the tone at the top wrong, then you're going to be fighting an uphill battle all the way. So we would always recommend in your compliance training that you bring in senior leaders, preferably have them speak in a video or possibly audio, to model what they believe good leaders do. And I think when you start to involve your senior leadership in the training, even if it's just a 30-minute video clip at the beginning of a course, you get certain benefits that come from that. First of all, you're saying our firm takes this very seriously, seriously enough for a senior leader to take time out of their busy schedule to record this clip to tell you quite how important the next 30 minutes of your life is going to be as you work through this training course and you understand all the behaviors that we need to see from you to keep our firm safe. It's also a fantastic way of both outlining what is expected of the individual, but also modeling what good looks like. The senior leader has a very important role in showing how their everyday compliant behavior is not something that they have to put a huge amount of effort in to perform. It's something that's woven into their daily practice. Being compliant is not something you do at the end of the day. It's not a task on your task list to be ticked off. It's embedded in all of your behaviors throughout the day. This is something that senior leaders can model, and if you can bring this into your training, that's a fantastic opportunity. I think the message around retaliation from senior leadership is absolutely vital. You can tell people there won't be a retaliation, and they might believe you and they might not, but what they will believe is a senior leader who goes on record saying, we want you to put your hands up if you see something wrong. That has a huge impact. And when they start to see that people are able to put their hands up without being retaliated upon, then that will start to have even more impact. Because number 5, speaking up is good for the company, and they should be hearing this from the very, very top.
When we built our own CLC piece of training, there were a couple of areas how we applied these principles. I think the first one was we included templates to include a video message from your Chief Compliance Officer, a senior member of management, and it allows us to rapidly include and people from your organization talking about what's important. When we roll out our CLC product, whether it's for anti-bribery, we strongly recommend that you do a structured interview and try and keep that clip to 30 to 60 seconds long. So we've been working with our clients to come up with closed questions, superlative statements, such as what are the top 3 tasks that everybody can do to help contribute to keeping our organization compliant. And what we found is an interview format with the executive speaking candidly from speaking points, it has a lot more authenticity than a Chief Compliance Officer reading from a teleprompter for 2 minutes. The final piece is, whilst we've created a great piece of training with CLC, getting the rollout right is critical. So what we do recommend thinking about, as well as tone at the top, is thinking about tone in the middle. How do you engage your middle management as part of your compliance strategy? And we do that in 2 areas. We'd recommend that you think about doing huddle groups for team meetings. So when you push out your anti-bribery training, also provide resources for middle management to include this in their weekly team meetings. Even if it's only for 5 minutes, it reinforces it and starts the dialogue. The second piece of recommendation we have if you were to roll out our CLC product is to include middle management in focus groups. So not only do we want to survey learners around how effective did you find this piece of training, reach out to your senior managers and middle managers to say, are your employees doing something differently? How is your training being perceived? And that gives you the feedback loop to ensure that it's getting better year on year.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and also thank you for correcting me. I have a horrible feeling I said 30 minutes per clip.
You did. I think everybody was clear you meant 30 seconds, or at least I hope they did.
Very good, very good. Just a couple of stats on the screen at the moment just show how important this tone from the top is. I mean, unfortunately, when we do look at incidents of, for example, bribery, we do find that it's at the very top that it tends to happen. 12% of the CEO was involved actively, so across the last couple of years, I believe. 41% of cases involved senior executives. So it's very much something that your general population will look up to see how the senior leaders are behaving, and if they're behaving in a certain way that's beneficial to the company, then the general population will want to emulate that behavior. Couldn't be more important. So we're going to talk about writing effective scenarios. Most compliance training these days includes scenarios, which is a good thing. It's where you have an opportunity to look at a real-life example and build out some action options and possibly ask the learner to make a decision or identify good practice or identify poor practice or reflect on what's just happened and look at what could have been done differently. We write many compliance scenarios for our clients, and we see them write their own. We see a huge mix in terms of the type of scenarios. Some are very personal, some are on a global scale. Obviously, if you're dealing with something like money laundering, there is essentially an element of criminality involved in that. So we do see scenarios around drug dealers laundering money, corrupt government officials, etc. But aside from those very specific topics, there's also an opportunity, I think, to make your scenarios as relevant as possible to the individual. So if I'm a learner and I'm looking at an anti-bribery and corruption scenario, it shouldn't only speak to people who have direct contact with government officials, for example, because that's some people in your company, but it's not everyone in your company. Try and find the way that this would actually impact the behavior of somebody in a different role within the organization, and make sure that your scenarios speak to the whole organization and not only the people who are at highest risk. In all compliance, we believe behavior trumps knowledge. So essentially with compliance, most people know how to behave. They know this stuff already. They might not know their exact gifts and attainments limit. They might not know their trading window around insider trading. There are some knowledge, factual pieces that they need to understand. But the general behaviors are fairly well known. Rather than testing people on an exact knowledge of an entire compliance policy, we believe you're much better putting forward the 4 or 5 behaviors that will keep themselves and their colleagues and the company safe. Where you can, keep it real, make the stories the kind of stories that we could all experience in our everyday life. and make it as conversational as possible. The great thing about scenarios is there doesn't have to be an absolute right answer. Scenarios are a good opportunity to look at grey areas. And when we talk about grey areas, we don't mean grey areas around ethics. That's always very clear what the right thing to do is, but we do look at the difference between doing the right thing in the right way and doing the right thing in the wrong way. If you do the right thing in the right way, you keep the company safe, but at the same time you manage the other people external to the company, and you don't risk impacting an important deal or losing an important customer or ruining an opportunity to move into a new market. If you do the right thing in a wrong way, you might protect your company, but you might lose that opportunity to move into the new market. You might antagonize a government official to the point where you can no longer do business in their region. You might antagonize a customer, or you might shout a little too early and raise a huge red flag when actually at that stage nothing is that clearly defined. So keep it conversational and always show the impact. With these scenarios, show not only the impact of what happens if you get it wrong, but show the impact of what happens if you get it right. We would recommend you include a scenario that allows the learner to see, well, if I spot this early and I manage it correctly and I escalate it appropriately, then the outcome creates tiny ripples, not huge waves throughout the organization. And that's a very positive message.
I think just in terms of how we approached this with CLC, there were a couple of things that we did that were interesting around scenarios. The first was for every 6 minutes of training that we run, we include a scenario, and we're using scenarios to teach primary concepts rather than just for testing, which makes for a much more engaging learning experience. The other lesson that we learned from designing our CLC product is there's a misconception that compliance officers, the general counsel, they have this tendency to dump policy into training courses, and that has happened perhaps historically. But what we've found is by having our CLC product and being able to show a scenario that is based upon proven action-based learning principles, once we give them a model, a chief compliance officer gets it and can very quickly follow that model for creating a scenario that works in their business. So if you give them a blank piece of paper, the scenarios often become long, wordy, don't really work from an instructional perspective. But if you can share something like our CLC product, it gives them a nice framework to follow, and you end up with some very strong scenarios that are relevant to your business. The other final comment I'd make here is we've been using scenarios in an innovative way for follow-up for engaging with regulators. So as part of our CLC offering, one thing we include is the ability to run a 10-minute scenario assessment 90 days after the primary anti-corruption training has been taken. And that does two very smart things. It reinforces the learning and reminds people of what's happened, what they've taken 90 days. So instructionally, it's great. And then secondly, it gives you a really nice piece of data that you can share with your regulators. So here's the training that happened with the primary event, and then here's the retention that we're getting in our audience. So think about scenarios for your primary training, but also consider adding a 10-minute scenario assessment that learners take 90 days after the primary training. And that could just be for a sample population of your learners. Not everybody has to go through that follow-up scenario. Back over to you, Matt.
Okay, so the fourth idea is this disparity sometimes between local rules and global rules. Most of the organizations we work with would like a consistent training program going out globally to the entire organization, but they're very aware of the fact that different regions are trying to manage different compliance regulators and regulations, and obviously there's the movement between regions as well. So this can become a very expensive business. Localizing an online compliance training course for 10 different regions is expensive enough. When you start having to produce different versions of that course and then localize those versions, now suddenly you're talking about a very expensive lift. We would recommend that you come up with a far simpler way of approaching the local requirements. E-learning is a fantastic way to push out that global requirement, and localizing those e-learnings so that people in different regions can take them and understand them is also a fantastic idea. When it comes down to the regional differences, we would recommend you go a little more low-tech. And also it's an opportunity to empower the local compliance leaders to do some of that work themselves and to put in what's important to them. What we're talking about when we do this is really producing formats, workbooks and templates which have the same look and feel, high quality as your e-learning pieces, but are designed for local leaders to input the information that they would really like to see. So suddenly your e-learning becomes part of a blended program. You'd still ask, for example, the German population to take your generic data privacy module, but in German. But you would also ask them to look at a workbook that had been produced specifically to cover the specific pieces of legislation that relate to that company. It helps you address the genuine local needs. It also reduces the necessity for somebody in, for example, New York to have a complete understanding of all the regulations across all the different regions in their business. And it keeps it timely as well. You may find that in a particular region something is particularly important because of an incident that's happened in that region, a headline, usually a negative headline, a new piece of legislation. So it's a great way of getting out the right message at the right time in a region without having to break the budget.
Neil, is it possible for us to have a look at our anti-bribery workbook? Lovely. So this is the concept that we followed within our own organisation when we produced our CLC product. So we have our anti-bribery and corruption piece of e-learning, but then we also have a accompanying workbook, which is what you're seeing here, for local country markets. The real magic behind this document is it's being created in a PowerPoint. Is that if once you roll out our e-learning course, we would also run a design session for your local compliance heads and teach them how to use this template to create a workbook for their own regional market. And that's got some huge advantages. The first is it's a tremendous cost saver because you're not producing a piece of e-learning for each market. And then secondly, we found that local compliance officers, if they are given the tools, something like this, to follow, they would much rather script and manage this themselves than have to go to an external vendor each time. And the flip side of it also is if you need to update it, if you need to make it long, if you need to make it short, it's a template that they can use to meet the specific requirements of their marketplace. So I think this idea of having a workbook template and then running a 60-minute session that guides a local compliance head, say in Germany, to produce this materials for their own market is a great way to engage your regional compliance heads without the expense of producing a course for every single country that you do business in.
Good. So I think the last topic we're going to look at today is the idea of getting creative. These are ideas that you could take forward in your organization without necessarily needing to work with an organization like ourselves. They are the additional pieces that you wrap around the formal training to make sure that it has impact in the business and to make sure that it elevates the compliance function within the business, but also that sense of a culture in which people do the right thing. Here are a few ideas. One of them is the use of infographics. We commonly use infographics to summarize training courses into a visually exciting and very mobile format. The great thing about an infographic delivered as a PDF is you can look at it on anything, your phone, your tablet, your PC. It can also be turned into a poster to fit onto the wall. It's a great way of packing information in a visual way that reduces it to very easy steps to follow. We also think that celebrating success is very important. We mentioned earlier in the scenarios that you should be looking for scenarios where somebody is rewarded for doing the right thing, speaking up early, and averting the disaster. The scenarios don't all need to focus on wrongdoing, and they don't all need to focus on drastic, terrible consequences, although it is important people understand what the negative consequences can be. Really, to get that behavior and cultural change, you'll probably have a better effect by celebrating success. Every organization has a different way of doing this, but we've seen some fantastic examples where organizations have celebrated people who raised a red flag or raised their hand in a certain situation. It turned out to be a completely safe situation, but the fact that they raised the red flag is celebrated and that person is given some kind of public kudos for being part of the culture of compliance that the organization is looking for. Borrow your public spaces. Every organization has large public spaces that the multitude of employees will cross at some point during the day. What a great opportunity to set up a small compliance stall or project a compliance image into the public space, or set up a booth that people can drop by to, or hand out leaflets as people are walking past. Something to say that compliance messaging is coming out of the classroom and out of the annual e-learning space and into the corridors and into the public spaces of the organization. It's cheap and easy to do. It can have an element of humor that you might not feel comfortable putting into the formal training, and it certainly shows people that the organization is taking compliance very seriously. I think the messaging has to be very memorable, and when we talk about being creative with compliance, everyone knows that a compliance policy is one of the drier reads available. If we can reduce the behaviors we're looking for and the messages that we're looking to put across into something that's very memorable and very short, then obviously it's something that people will carry with them. And the coattail effect as well. What other initiatives are going on in the organization where you can ride on the coattails and get your compliance message across as part of a wider initiative? And we've seen that work effectively in other organizations as well.
When we approached building our own CLC compliance products, we really did sit down as a team and think about creativity. And we made a deliberate decision to stay away from being bleeding edge. And instead, we've tried to come up with something that really moves the quality of compliance forward, but is quite selective. So if you're rolling out a compliance program at a Global 100 firm, you may well have to push 50 to 70,000 employees through that particular program, and completion rates become critical. So I think if you look at our training in terms of what we've produced, it's creative, it's fresh, it's a step forward in the marketplace around what's offered, but we've deliberately avoided it being a huge departure from what learners are used to so that they can quickly navigate and get through the training. And I think for us, that's been the right place for us to build and aim our products at. Matt, do you want to summarize what we've covered for today?
Yeah, so I think we've looked at 5 ideas. I think the first thing we looked at is that good compliance programs work. If you get it right, there will be less, there will be reduced risk, but what risk there is will be observed more, and when it is observed, it will be reported more, and the reason it will be reported is because people won't fear retaliation. So that's what happens when you get it right. How do you get it right? Well, you tell stories that are relevant to the individuals involved, so they feel that the content they're looking at is about them. You make sure that the tone from the top is present by including your senior leaders in the training as much as possible to model behavior, but also to make it clear that this is a company in which speaking up and remaining compliant is more than a box-ticking exercise for a regulator. It's part of who we are and what we do. Manage your country-specific requirements without busting your budget. Look for low-tech ways to empower local compliance leaders to provide the content specific to their region as an addendum, not necessarily an alternative to, but as an addition to the formal training that you're pushing out from the centre. And finally, be creative. And if you're not comfortable as an organisation being creative in the formal training, the formal e-learning, that's absolutely fine and understandable, but there's still an opportunity to be creative around how you message compliance outside of the formal training. Companies, if you look at Progressive Insurance, probably the best example of this at the moment, the way they message compliance, it's as much fun as their adverts are. They leverage their advertising and brand to a great extent. So that's a quick summary of what we've covered today so far.
It looks like we'll just take 5 minutes to give a very brief overview in terms of where we are. We finished producing some new assets only last week, which we'd like to, I won't call it a world premiere, but just let you take a peek at it. I think they're pretty interesting. And that should allow us to wrap up 5 minutes early. But if you move forward there, Neil, I've got a slight echo. You might just want to pop yourself on mute there, Matt. So this is what we're launching with. This is our curriculum, which is going live. It's being used in organizations today. And we have over 60 standalone learning topics. So each of those stars represents a standalone piece of training, which is 6 to 8 minutes long in duration. And if you take our anti-bribery program on the top left there, the beauty of this is you can mix and match these topics to create your own anti-bribery program, but then we can also add content that is specific to your business, either in terms of a new topic or by adding screens. And then just moving forward, if you have a look at our compliance products in anti-bribery, at the heart of it is an ability to customize it. The more that we make it relevant to your business, the more it's going to have impact. And we do that like the rest of our peers by having branding, policy links, and custom welcomes. But we've also worked really hard to come up with a series of new screens that you can add so that you can cover content specific to your business. And then also we have a very easy model that allows you to change the script and cover content specific to your business. And what we wanted to show you for 2 minutes is some assets that be worth taking a peek at. And we'll just have a look at the customization kit now, Neil. So if you were to take a look at our anti-bribery course, it would be worth keeping in mind that we have a sequence of template screens which we might just take a peek at. So here is an empty one. This is a carousel interaction. And then we'll see on the next screen here how it's been populated. We're using a building company in this example. Let's just have a look at another couple, if you don't mind, Neil. And we decided to have a simple image and text. And we'll just show that populated. And then let's have a look at the template screen for a scenario which is shown on the next screen. Fantastic. So basically, by setting these up, what we're able to do is very quickly create scenarios that are specific to your firm with your imagery, with stories specific to your firm. So we've taken a lot of that headache around, you've got a great compliance product, but we need to include a scenario that includes a bribery situation that would be relevant to our business. So I think it's something that we're really proud of. It's an area that we've worked hard on, and we're getting a great response in terms of how we've approached that. The final thing to say is, I mean, what we've produced, I think, is a good model for how to approach an anti-bribery program. Even if you're not working with us, I think it's a good opportunity to benchmark around your own bribery training. And there are 2 ways that you can do that. We're happy to meet one-on-one and do a short briefing to walk you through our anti-bribery offering. And then secondly, and if you could maybe just jump back to the main slide there, Neil, we are sponsoring our industry's biggest event, the SEC's Compliance and Ethics Institute, their 3-day conference in Las Vegas. I don't know why there is an ethics conference in Las Vegas, but that's the way that it's shaken out. We will be sponsoring that, and we will be demoing our new CLC Center as part of the program down there. So if any of you are attending, it would be great to hear from you, and we can also put you in touch with the SEC if you're sending a group of individuals to arrange discounted rates. So I think that brings it to an end in terms of the presentation. A copy of this will be available with those 5 recommendations and a breakdown of the tips for creating training. We are tremendously passionate about compliance training. We'd like this to be a dialogue. There are ongoing events. So we really hope that you got a lot of value out of the ideas that we've presented today, and we would like it to be the start of an ongoing dialogue. So a big thank you to everyone who participated, and Matt, our Chief Learning Officer, for presenting some great ideas today. Thank you.